Growing up, I never paid much attention to the stories about haunted objects. They always felt like urban legends, the kind of tales older kids whispered to scare the younger ones. My family was the same, grounded in reality, unimpressed by anything remotely supernatural. That belief began to waver when we inherited a peculiar porcelain doll after my grandmother passed away. It was small, fragile-looking, and eerily lifelike, sitting perfectly still yet unnervingly full of presence. The doll wasn't just an heirloom. It was a centerpiece of curiosity. My mother, ever the enthusiast for antiques, decided to display it prominently in our living room. Its glassy blue eyes seemed to glimmer under the light, catching anyone's attention the moment they walked into the room. My little sister, Ellie, was captivated by it instantly, giving it the name Lily. At first, I dismissed Ellie's fascination as childish wonder, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease I felt every time I looked at it. Lily was pristine, almost too pristine for its supposed age. It had rosy cheeks painted delicately on its porcelain face, and a smile that seemed to change depending on how you looked at it. The doll wore a lace-trimmed dress, its design as old-fashioned as something from a forgotten era. Even though it was just an object, it felt out of place, as though it didn't belong in our modern home. Ellie adored it, talking to it as if it were her newest friend, but I avoided it whenever I could. My mother was delighted by Lily's charm, oblivious to the silent tension growing in the house. She admired it daily, even placing fresh flowers near the mantel to complement the doll's elegance. My father, ever the skeptic, teased us for feeling creeped out by a silly piece of porcelain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes followed me, that its faint smile seemed to widen when no one was looking. It was a subtle unease at first, but it grew stronger with every passing day. Ellie insisted on playing with Lily, often sitting cross-legged in front of the mantel, chatting with the doll as if it could respond. She'd even leave little gifts, a shiny marble, a scrap of ribbon, at Lily's feet. "She likes them," Ellie said one day, her voice matter-of-fact. She told me. My stomach churned at her words, but I tried to convince myself it was just the imagination of a young child. Then came the first night when the crying began. It was faint, barely audible, like the soft whimper of someone far away. At first I thought it was the wind or an animal outside, but the sound was unmistakably human, soft sobs that carried a sadness so heavy it sent chills down my spine. I lay frozen in bed, straining my ears, unable to convince myself it was all in my head. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The next morning, I casually asked my parents if they had heard anything unusual. My father waved it off as an old house creaking at night, while my mother teased me for being overly imaginative. But Ellie said nothing, her wide eyes darting toward Lily as if she knew something the rest of us didn't. Night after night, the crying returned. Each time, it grew louder and more distinct, no longer a faint sound but a clear, sorrowful wail that echoed through the house. My parents remained unfazed, but I noticed Ellie had stopped talking to Lily as much. She seemed quieter, more reserved, like she was keeping a secret she didn't dare share. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I tiptoed downstairs to find the source of the sound. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The crying seemed to come from the mantel where Lily sat, her glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. My breath hitched as I stood frozen, unable to move closer, yet unable to turn away. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The crying stopped immediately, leaving an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the room remained still. Finally, I forced myself to move, rushing back to my room and locking the door behind me. That night I barely slept. Ellie, however, seemed unfazed the next day, as if nothing had happened. But I could tell something had changed in her. She no longer left her little gifts for Lily and avoided looking at the doll altogether. When I asked her why, she shrugged and muttered, "She's mad at me." I didn't press her for details, but her words lingered in my mind all day. The unease grew thicker as the days went by. Every time I entered the living room, I felt a weight in the air, a heaviness that wasn't there before. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me more intensely, its smile somehow more sinister. My parents continued to dismiss my concerns, even as Ellie became more withdrawn and jumpy. By the second week, the crying had transformed into whispers, soft, incoherent murmurs that seemed to seep into the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate, as if someone was trapped and begging for release. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was my imagination, but deep down I knew better. One evening, Ellie came running into my room, her face pale and tear-streaked. "She moved," she whispered, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. I saw her move. Her voice was shaky, her fear palpable. I believed her, even if my parents wouldn't. After that, I couldn't stand being alone in the living room. Even in broad daylight, the doll exuded an unsettling aura that seemed to drain the warmth from the space. I began to notice small changes. Lily's head tilted slightly, her hands positioned differently than before. My parents insisted it was Ellie playing tricks, but Ellie swore she hadn't touched it. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding me with an invisible pressure that made it hard to breathe. I started to dread the approach of midnight, knowing that was when the house would fall silent except for the doll's eerie lament. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, I decided to confront Lily. I waited until my family was asleep, then crept downstairs with a flashlight in hand. The living room was dark, the shadows stretching long and menacing across the walls. Lily sat on the mantel, her glassy eyes catching the beam of my flashlight as if mocking me. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The doll remained still, its porcelain face unchanging. I reached out a shaking hand, determined to prove to myself that it was just an object, nothing more. But the moment my fingers touched its dress, a cold, electric jolt shot through me, and I stumbled back in terror. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my bed, clutching the flashlight, my heart racing with fear. I knew now that Lily wasn't just a doll. She was something else, something far beyond my understanding. And whatever she wasn't done with us yet. Clara's words sent a chill down my spine, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. She explained that a vessel was an object imbued with a malevolent spirit, often used to manipulate and torment the living. "Whoever gave this to your family knew exactly what they were doing," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The spirit attached to this doll feeds on fear, and it's growing stronger every day." My parents exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism beginning to waver in the face of Clara's conviction. Clara began setting up her tools around the house, sprinkling salt in doorways and burning sage to cleanse the air. The scent was pungent but oddly comforting, as though it was pushing back the darkness that had enveloped our home. She instructed us to stay in the living room while she conducted her ritual, warning us not to interfere no matter what we heard. Her words were unsettling, but we agreed, desperate for any solution to the nightmare that had consumed our lives. As Clara moved through the house, chanting softly, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. Shadows seemed to dance on the walls, flickering unnaturally in the dim light. My parents clung to each other, while Ellie buried her face in my shoulder, too terrified to look. I felt a mix of fear and guilt, wondering if I had somehow unleashed this horror upon my family by burying Lily in the first place. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the direction of Ellie's room, followed by a blood-curdling scream that made my heart stop. Clara emerged moments later, her face pale but determined. "It's angry," she said, gripping a small, intricately carved box. "But I've contained it for now." She explained that the spirit had been drawn into the box during her ritual, but it was far from defeated. "This isn't over," she warned. "The spirit is strong, and it will try to break free." We watched in stunned silence as Clara carefully sealed the box with wax and tied it with a red ribbon. She explained that the box needed to be buried far from any living beings, in a place where it could remain undisturbed. "If anyone opens this," she said gravely, "the spirit will return, and it will be more vengeful than ever." My father volunteered to take the box to a remote location the following morning, determined to protect his family at all costs. That night, for the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. Ellie slept peacefully in her bed, and my parents seemed more at ease, their skepticism finally giving way to relief. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows still seemed darker than they should have been, and every creak of the floorboards sent my imagination spiraling. But I told myself it was over, clinging to Clara's assurances that the spirit was contained. The next morning, my father set out early, taking the box to an old quarry miles away from town. He returned hours later, exhausted but confident that he had done the right thing. "It's buried deep," he said, his voice steady. "No one will ever find it." We all breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful that the ordeal seemed to be behind us. For the first time in what felt like forever, our home felt like a safe haven again. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. Ellie regained her cheerful demeanor, and the strange occurrences that had plagued our house ceased entirely. My parents seemed happier, and even I began to let go of the lingering fear that had gripped me. But deep down, a small part of me remained wary, unable to fully trust that the spirit was truly gone. I couldn't forget Clara's warning or the malevolent energy I had felt in the doll's presence. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I thought I heard a faint whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen, but the house remained silent. I told myself it was just my imagination, a remnant of the trauma we had endured. But as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Life carried on, but the shadow of what we had experienced lingered in quiet moments. Even though the house had returned to its peaceful state, I often caught myself glancing at Ellie's door or listening intently to the silence, as though expecting something to break it. Ellie was happy again, laughing and playing like nothing had happened. My parents acted as if everything was normal, but I noticed how my mother would occasionally clutch her necklace, muttering a silent prayer, and how my father now triple-checked every lock in the house before bed. As for me, I tried to convince myself it was over. I focused on school, hung out with friends, and even managed to sleep through most nights without waking up in a cold sweat. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. It was subtle, like a faint itch in the back of my mind, and it made me question whether Clara's ritual had truly been enough. One evening, months after the ordeal, I decided to check on Ellie before going to bed. She was fast asleep, clutching a new stuffed bear that my father had bought to replace Lily. The sight was comforting, and for the first time in a while, I felt truly at ease. I kissed her forehead and left the room, closing the door softly behind me. As I turned away, I could have sworn I heard a faint giggle, light and childlike, coming from inside. My heart froze, but when I opened the door again, Ellie was still sound asleep. The room was silent. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my mind, a memory resurfacing in the stillness of the night. But as I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I dreamed of the doll again, not as it had been, but as it was when Clara had held it, blackened, burned, and empty. In the dream, it stared at me with hollow eyes, its head tilting ever so slightly as if to say, "I'm still here." When I woke up, the memory of the dream lingered, sharper than I wanted it to be. I sat in bed, staring out the window as the first light of dawn crept into the room. I thought of Clara's warning, of the doll, and of the box my father had buried in the quarry. A question gnawed at me, one I couldn't ignore. Was the spirit truly gone, or had it simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to return? For now, the house remains quiet and life goes on. But I've learned not to let my guard down. Some things I've realized don't stay buried. They linger, waiting in the shadows, feeding on fear. And if they ever come back, I'll be ready. At least I hope I will be. That's the thing about evil. It doesn't disappear. It adapts. And sometimes, all you can do is keep your eyes open and hope you never have to face it again. The days that followed my encounter with Lily were nothing short of torturous. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, tiptoeing around the living room as if the doll might spring to life at any moment. Ellie, once so infatuated with Lily, refused to even glance in her direction. She clung to me at night, trembling and begging me not to leave her alone. My parents, oblivious to the escalating tension, chalked it all up to childish imagination and dismissed our fears with exasperated sighs. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, a soft tapping, like fingernails rapping against glass. My heart pounded as I realized it was coming from the living room. Mustering every ounce of courage, I crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness below. There, in the dim moonlight, I could make out Lily's silhouette sitting on the mantel, completely still. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the silent house. I wanted to believe it was the wind or some natural cause, but deep down I knew better. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a signal. As I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, I suddenly felt a chill pass over me, as though something unseen had brushed by. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, trapped by an invisible force. Ellie's screams broke the paralysis, jolting me into action. I rushed to her room, finding her curled up in a corner, tears streaming down her face. "She's in here," Ellie sobbed, pointing toward the shadows near her closet. My heart sank as I turned to look, half expecting to see Lily's porcelain face staring back at me. But there was nothing there, only the suffocating darkness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. That night, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't let this continue, not for Ellie's sake, and certainly not for my own. The next day, I confronted my parents, demanding that we get rid of the doll. My father laughed, dismissing me as hysterical, while my mother insisted that Lily was harmless. Frustrated and desperate, I resolved to take matters into my own hands. Late that night, while everyone else was asleep, I crept into the living room with a heavy sense of dread. Lily sat on the mantel, her glassy eyes gleaming in the moonlight, as if she knew what I was planning. My hands shook as I reached for her, half expecting her to move or make a sound. But she remained still, unnervingly so, as I carried her to the backyard. I dug a hole beneath the old oak tree, determined to bury her and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. As I dropped the doll into the shallow grave, a sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, chilling me to the bone. The air felt electric, heavy with an unspoken warning, but I pressed on, shoveling dirt over Lily until she was completely covered. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from my chest. I returned to the house, exhausted but hopeful that the nightmare was finally over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The following day, the house felt eerily quiet, almost peaceful. Ellie seemed to return to her cheerful self, playing with her toys and laughing like she used to. My parents noticed the change and teased me for overreacting, convinced that my imagination had gotten the best of me. I wanted to believe they were right, that Lily was gone for good, and that we could move on. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct, as though whoever, or whatever, was behind them was growing bolder. I could hear my name being called, faint but unmistakable, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head like a child. But the sound grew more insistent. It wasn't just in my head. It was real, coming from somewhere inside the house. And then I heard it, the faint rhythmic tapping just like before. Panic surged through me as I realized the sound was coming from my closet. I stared at the door, my heart pounding, willing it to stay shut. But then it began to creak open, ever so slowly, revealing the dark void within. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as a figure emerged, small and shadowy, with glinting blue eyes. It was Lily, or something wearing her form, staring at me with a smile that no longer looked human. The next morning, I awoke in a cold sweat, unsure if it had all been a dream. But when I looked at my closet, the door was wide open, and the faint scent of earth lingered in the air. I checked the backyard, hoping to find the grave undisturbed, but the ground beneath the oak tree was freshly dug. Lily was gone, and I knew she was back inside the house. From that day forward, the activity escalated. Lights flickered uncontrollably, objects moved on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more menacing. Ellie began sleepwalking, wandering through the house in the dead of night, muttering incoherent phrases. My parents finally began to take notice, but they were still reluctant to believe that Lily was the cause. It was as though the doll had a hold on them, clouding their judgment and feeding off their disbelief. One night, as the chaos reached its peak, I decided to seek help. I reached out to an old friend of my grandmother's, a woman named Clara, who was rumored to have a gift for sensing the supernatural. Clara agreed to visit the house, bringing with her an assortment of strange tools and artifacts. The moment she stepped inside, her face darkened and she muttered something under her breath. "This doll," she said, "isn't just cursed. It's a vessel,